Alright, hopefully I can talk quickly about the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ended World War I. Question number 1, what were the 14 points, and what was Wilson's purpose for them? Alright, when the United States had declared war, President Wilson said that he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Well, in order to do that, he thought that a peace treaty at the end of the war would be a perfect opportunity for him to do that. And so he saw the peace treaty as an opportunity to kind of spread his vision for what he wanted the world to look like at the end of the war. And so he came up with, during the war, these things called the 14 points. This was his blueprint for peace. If the world would just do these 14 things, then you would prevent future wars. Or at the very least, they would be extremely quick and extremely isolated. And we'll see why here in just a second. Without going into grand detail, points 1 through 4 were about securing the rights of countries that Wilson felt this is what had started World War I. Freedom of the seas, respecting each other's territorial integrity, outlawing secret alliances. These are some of the big things in those first points. The vast majority of them dealt with the adjustment of territory after the war. And one of the things Wilson wanted was the self-determination for all people. Self-determination is where a minority group would get to choose its own destiny. Take Austria-Hungary as the great example. Austria-Hungary had conquered so many different ethnic groups, so many different nations. Self-determination would allow those people to decide, did they want to continue to be part of a greater Austria-Hungarian nation, or did they want to be independent? And with that, it was the idea of you would have local elections. So you would have communities kind of deciding where they wanted to go. The idea being a majority ethnic population would choose where it wanted to go, and it would choose to be its own country. The 14th point in Wilson's 14 points was the creation of what was called the League of Nations. And that's going to be the big focus of Wilson's plan for peace, this League of Nations. That was kind of the thing, the linchpin that was going to hold it all together. Okay? And so some details on the League of Nations, what Wilson envisioned it as. To him, this was the most important point. Without the League of Nations, the whole 14 points was pretty useless. What it was an international peacekeeping body. If you want to think of it as the United Nations, you can, for the most part, because it was the precursor to the UN. And so its goal was to make sure something like World War I never happened again. Essentially, it would provide a forum where countries that had grievances against each other could come, they could discuss their problems openly, they could discuss their problems among the other nations of the world, and that together we could come up with a solution that would prevent war. Question number 2. What were the final provisions of the Treaty of Versailles? This is not, what did Wilson want? This is what actually went into the treaty. Alright, so Wilson shows up with the 14 points. He went personally. This was something no other president had ever done. In any war, no president had gone to personally negotiate the treaty. We had always sent ambassadors and representatives. But he went personally, and kind of the idea was he was afraid someone would compromise on his 14 points, and since this was his great blueprint, he wanted to make sure it went into effect. Unfortunately, those who criticized Wilson, and you're always going to have political opponents, but there were people who said that he was just grandstanding. Basically, he was trying to puff up his chest, he was trying to look big in front of not only Americans, but also the rest of the world. He makes a mistake when he refuses to take any Republicans with him on the trip. Now remember, Wilson is a Democrat, and we might say, okay, he's a Democrat, why would he bring some Republicans? Well, in the elections of 1918, Republicans had took control of both the House and the Senate. And so they are in charge of an entire branch of government, kind of like now. And so you have to negotiate with them. You have to take into account their views. With the Senate Republicans are going to have to ratify the treaty. So in theory, you would want to make sure that their ideas are included. But instead, Wilson chooses to leave them all behind, which is going to kind of feed the flames of his political opposition, saying, you know, why did you ignore what we want? When Wilson arrived in France, the negotiations over the treaty ended up being dominated by this group that we've come to call the Big Four. Here they are. You have David Lloyd George from Britain, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, Georges Clemenceau from France, and of course Woodrow Wilson. Now, these Big Four end up kind of quickly being reduced down to the Big Three. They pretty much ignore Wilson and his 14 points. In Europe's view, America didn't do much in World War I. World War I started in 1914. We didn't join until 1917. We miss most of the death and destruction. And so, while we may view us as kind of being the great turning point in World War I, they saw us as kind of the tag-alongs. So when they ignore Wilson, when they ignore the 14 points, it really ends up being the three of them. As the leaders at Versailles start negotiating, they decide to start cutting up the map of Europe, and they don't consider Wilson's idea of self-determination. Right? They carve up territory without regard for really who lives there. Oh, sure, we look at the map of Europe after World War I, and we see the creation of all these new countries made up of these different ethnic groups. Finland's for the Finns. Okay? We have a recreation of Poland for the Poles, Czechoslovakia. And here's one of the examples of them ignoring people. Czechoslovakia is made up of the Czechs and the Slovaks. And historically, they never went to war, but historically they're somewhat antagonistic toward each other. Their heritage is similar, but it's not exact. And so there are a lot of cultural differences between these two groups that they just jam together right here. Okay? Yugoslavia. Another wonderful example. Yugoslavia means basically land of a bunch of Slavic people who hate each other. You have Croatia in here, you have Bosnia in here. This is what Serbia used to be. So you throw all these different ethnic groups in here, along with one or two others. Got other ethnic groups down around here. Maybe you remember Macedonia. Macedonia is right in here. And so, but whatever, they put them all in the same country. And then the territory that they take from, this area right in here, it's pretty much all German. And instead they give it to Poland. This area right here in Czechoslovakia, mostly German. And again, they give it to another country. And so they cut up this territory without respect for who lives there and without taking into their feelings. Other nations are totally ignored, or virtually ignored, which created lasting resentment. Okay? Japan was an ally during World War I. They attacked German possessions in the Pacific. And they are pretty much ignored by this treaty. They thought they were going to get territory. Instead, all of the German territory is going to be given to the League of Nations to administer. And so Japan felt, wait a minute, how come we weren't considered in the treaty? That's not fair. Also, Italy. Even though Vittorio Orlando is there, and he's part of the Big Four, which I've said is the Big Three, when they don't give him what he wants from Austria, he leaves, turning the negotiations really into those dominated by the Big Two, Britain and France. The Treaty of Versailles, the specific Treaty of Versailles, deals with Germany and how Germany is going to be treated at the end of the war. In 1919, it is determined that Germany is going to pay $63 billion in reparations, payments for war damages. That is $63 billion in 1919 money. So we're not adjusting for inflation here. That is, in 1919, they said, okay, here's your bill, $63 billion. That would have the effect of crippling Germany's economy, which is actually what Britain and specifically France want to do, to make sure Germany can't rearm and attack within the next maybe 1 or 2 decades. They also write into the Treaty of Versailles this thing called the War Guilt Clause. Whose fault is it? And the war becomes solely the fault of Germany, according to the War Guilt Clause. There's some other smaller things, but those first two are the big things that the Germans were upset about. Overseas colonies in Africa, islands in the Pacific, those are going to be taken and given to the League of Nations. You had other territories around Germany, and you saw in the last map, that were given to neighboring countries. Okay? Here it is again, this territory here, mostly German, given to Poland. This area right in here, this Alsace and Lorraine, Germany had taken that from France in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War. Well, it's given back. This area right in here, this is the Rhineland. This remains part of Germany. And they're not allowed to station any troops in it. They're not allowed to control this piece of territory that is still theirs. You also had an area here called the Saar, which actually France would end up invading within a couple of years because Germany defaulted on some of its original reparations payments. Also, the Treaty of Versailles forbid German rearmament. They were reduced to some ridiculously small number for something the size of Germany, something like 100,000 total soldiers in their army, which for a nation the size of Germany, like I said, is just absolutely absurd. It is ridiculously small. This stuff, and as I said, mostly numbers 1 and 2 there, the reparations and the War Guilt Clause, caused so much resentment within the population in Germany that's going to allow the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, as they preyed on those feelings of resentment. And they basically told the people of Germany, look, you got the raw end of the deal here. Right? Why is it that we had to give up so much when in reality we had not been invaded, when we didn't have to contend with Allied troops? And essentially they say the Treaty of Versailles is punishing you, and it's crippling you, and it's this oppressive weight that needs to be removed. Now, all this stuff is in violation of what Wilson wanted. Wilson didn't want this. Wilson wanted to prevent future wars. This is going to cause another one. And just in case I blew the foreshadowing, it's going to cause another war. But whatever, Wilson gave in. Wilson took all of this because his deal was, okay, I will accept this. I will accept the loss of the rest of my 14 points, as long as I can get that 14th one, as long as I can get the League of Nations. I'll be willing to accept all this stuff that's being done, because to him the League of Nations was going to solve it all. It wouldn't matter. The League of Nations was going to be the thing. And so, as a bone to Wilson, they throw in the League of Nations with the treaty. And they built it to where if you ratify the treaty, once you ratify the treaty, you were a part of the League of Nations. That's it. That's how you got in. You ratified the treaty. Everybody who's not a party to the treaty, in other words, all these other countries that are out there that didn't participate in World War I, they would have to formally join the League. But this is how you do it. Ratify the treaty. Okay. Within the treaty was the governing document of the League of Nations, this thing called the Covenant of the League of Nations. Covenant of the League of Nations just set out the structure of how it was going to be done, the laws, the rules for how it would be governed and administered, and what powers each particular part would have. But the big sticking point is going to be Article 10. Article 10 in the Covenant of the League of Nations. Article 10 basically said an attack against one is an attack against all. Purpose of that is the idea that if one country launched a military attack on another one, all the members of the League of Nations would basically declare war on the aggressor. And so instead of it being one country against one country, you would have one country against all the nations of the world. And, you know, it's not going to be, not like every nation is going to make a big difference. Sorry, you little bitty countries that don't matter. But, you know, think of the big countries, Britain, France, the United States. We could bring overwhelming military and economic force against an aggressor. This was kind of a last step, kind of the last straw. If we've exhausted every single possible option, right here, this is where, you know, an aggressor would say, wait a minute, before we do this, we have to consider we're not going to war against this tiny little country. We're going to war against the rest of the world. Question number 3. Based on the cartoon, how did many Americans feel about the Treaty of Versailles? So we have the cartoon here. I'll go ahead and blow it up real quick. Here we have a preacher reading from the League of Nations here. We have the bride, foreign entanglements. This would be Uncle Sam right here. Down here on the floor we have peace proceedings. Up here the preacher says, if any man can show just cause why they not lawfully be joined together, let him speak now. And through the window comes the Senate with this document which says constitutional rights. So I'll let you think about that for a minute. You can pause if you need to. Question number 4. Why was the Treaty of Versailles ultimately defeated in the U.S. Senate? So Wilson brought the treaty back, brought it to America, and not everybody is in favor of it. You have some ordinary Americans who were opposed to the treaty. Some of them, German Americans, thought it was too harsh. Irish Americans were upset that it didn't guarantee independence for the Irish. Jewish Americans were already, during World War I, hoping for the creation of a Jewish nation or state in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire had been broken up, so why wouldn't you create a Jewish homeland? Other people felt that it was too lenient, that Germany had caused this great destruction, and so we're not punishing them enough. Also, some people were upset because Wilson's goal of the 14 points was unrealized. Points basically 1 through 13 are ignored. This doesn't seem to be what we were fighting for. Republicans in the Senate also, of course, opposed the treaty. A lot of it is political, of course. You have a guy named Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge was the Senate Majority Leader. So he is in charge of not only all the Republicans in the Senate, but he gets a lot of say over what legislation gets brought before the Senate. He's also a reservationist, meaning he has some reservations, he has some hesitations about the Treaty of Versailles. He thinks that it has problems and he wants to see those adjusted. Also, 1919 is just the year before the election of 1920. Henry Cabot Lodge wants to be able to use this as an opportunity to gain public support for the Republicans in the election. And so if he can discredit the treaty, he can discredit Wilson. If he can discredit Wilson, he can discredit the Democrats and give his party a better shot in 1920. Because of both of these things, he extended the debate on the Treaty of Versailles, his idea being that the American public would lose interest over time. And once the American public lost interest, it would kind of be, oh wait, we're still at war? Well, why can't you guys solve that? You know, why can't you just turn it off or something? You know, like it's a light switch. And then the public would cease. Those that cared about the treaty would cease to care. You also had another group of Republicans in the Senate, and they were called the Irreconcilables. The Irreconcilables are the guys who are going to refuse to sign any treaty that includes America joining something like the League of Nations. They felt that the League of Nations was going to be a violation of the U.S. Constitution. Only Congress has the power to declare war. Yet, because of Article 10, this would kind of automatically cause the United States to join a military conflict without Congress necessarily having any say in the matter. And that concerned them. That concerned them that there was going to be something the United States had to live by that was above the Constitution. So the Senate started debating the treaty. The reservationists, Henry Cabot Lodge, tried to amend the treaty. Senator Lodge actually introduced 14 amendments, kind of as a little jab at Wilson. When Wilson found out about all this stuff, Wilson refused to negotiate with Congress at all over the treaty. He said, no, the treaty will be approved the way it's written. There will be no changes. There will be no negotiations. Absolutely nothing. So he sees his way as right, the Republicans see their way as right, and no one is really willing to compromise. There's some historians that suggest that if Wilson and the Senate Democrats had compromised on some issues within the treaty that ultimately didn't matter, that the Republicans may have ended up supporting it and it might have been ratified. But instead, neither party wants to really negotiate. In September of 1919, with the Senate not doing anything, Wilson went on a public speaking tour. And his goal was to go around the country and generate public support for the treaty, generate support for the League of Nations, get the people to put pressure on the Senate to ratify it, and thus get it ratified. Unfortunately, his schedule is a little too overwhelming. On September 25th, he was in Pueblo, Colorado, and after his speech, he went backstage and he collapsed. And doctors diagnosed it as just simply being due to exhaustion. It's also worth noting that while he was in France negotiating the treaty, there was about a 2-week period where he went into his hotel room and he didn't come out. And there has been speculation within probably the last 20 years that he was either having a series of miniature strokes, or, what some people think is more likely, he caught the flu, which back then would have been called the Spanish flu. This is the influenza virus that swept through the world right around 1918, 1919, 1920. And we estimate it killed about 80 million people around the world. But he might have had that, so he's got some physical issues before the speaking tour, and the speaking tour just kind of wipes him out. Well, he goes back to Washington, where on October 2nd, he has a massive stroke. And for the next 7.5 months, he will not meet with his cabinet. He will very rarely see anyone within the government as he recovers from the stroke, without him being the physical presence to push the Treaty of Versailles. It's going to die in the Senate. In May of 1920, after the treaty had been brought up for a vote 3 different times and failed all 3 different times, Congress finally just voted to remove the declaration of war from 1917. That was how we were going to end World War I. We were just going to say, never mind, we're not at war anymore. Wilson actually vetoed it. His plan was, look, this is an election year. We're going to make this an election year issue. And if you vote, if you want the Treaty of Versailles, if you want the League of Nations, then it's a referendum on me. It's a referendum on the Democratic Party, and I'm going to push that issue. In 1920, the Democrats lost that election. And so finally, in 1921, the United States, again, the Congress voted to rescind their declaration of war. And this time, the new president signed it. And that's how we ended World War I. Right, with just a congressional resolution saying, oh, the United States is no longer at war with anyone in Europe. One last question for you here before we go. Franklin, I'm sure at this point you're asleep, so hopefully somebody will let you know that there is actually a 5th question you need to answer. Question 5, what does the author of this cartoon believe about U.S. participation in the League of Nations? Again, I'll blow it up. I will also tell you that this cartoon was written by a guy living in London. So that might help you a little bit as you try to figure this thing out. So here's Uncle Sam here. He's on the Keystone. If you can't figure out from the context of the cartoon, you might want to look up what a keystone is. And here we have, this League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the USA. And here we have the League of Nations bridge, Belgium, France, England, and Italy, with a spacer in between. And the caption, of course, says, the gap in the bridge. So I'm sure you're doing this once again the night before it's due. So don't forget, you have a test tomorrow. Good luck. I'll see you in class.